Hi everyone, and welcome to VisibleThread's webinar, Plain Language, Embracing a New Enterprise Strategy for Communication Wins. My name is Evelyn Wolf, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at VisibleThread, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here today. So before we kick off with our great panelists, I just want to give you a bit of details. So today our webinar will last about an hour. There is a question facility at the side of your GoToWebinar control panel. So if you have any questions, please enter them there, and we have a Q&A session at the end. There's also a short survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you could complete it for us. We'd love to hear what you thought about the webinar today and what you'd like us to cover in future sessions. We will share the recording and the slides with everybody a few days after the event. We're aiming for Monday morning. And if there are any additional questions that you may have after the webinar or any comments at all, please feel free to email me, evelyn.wolf@visiblethread.com. It's a great pleasure today to be joined by our three panelists, and I'd love to introduce them to you. Our three panelists are going to really answer the big question for us. How can we create enterprise level content that really engages and really resonates with our audience? Plain and simple, we're going to be addressing this today with our panelist. Jeff Meldrum, the Director of Communications for the Canadian Human Rights Commission, is going to kick us off on the benefits of the plain language strategy. Jeff has been with the Commission, as you can see there on the slide, for quite some time and has ensured that the Commission communicates in a concise and accessible way with their audience. We then have Kevin Press, who's an economics blogger and formerly of Sun Life Financial. Kevin was responsible for implementing a plain language program at Sun Life. So he's going to be telling us all about that and giving us some tips about how to implement strategy. And then we're going to hand it over to Manu, who is the Director of Digital Transformation at the Treasury Board of Canada, who's going to talk to us about the effectiveness and measurement of plain language at canada.ca. So I think without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff. Jeff, are you ready to go?
Yes, thanks very much. It's great to be here. Just for starters, as you said, my name is Jeff Meldrum, and I'm the Director of Communications. I work for the Human Rights Commission, which is an independent body that holds the government to account on matters related to human rights. And it also promotes inclusion and equality in Canada. So what that means is we speak out on matters related to human rights, we do research, and we also receive complaints from Canadians when they feel they've been treated unfairly because of things like their race, their religion, or their disability. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is when I first arrived at the Commission, this was the mission statement. And so what we did as a communications team to try to bring about an understanding of plain language was we took this mission statement down onto the street with a camera, and we asked people to read the mission statement and then explain to us what it meant. And as you can imagine, the responses we got were pretty humorous, pretty varied. And once we got the response, we then asked the person what they did for a living, what their education level was. And in many cases, the people that were, miffed or dumbfounded by this statement actually had master's degrees and PhD, and that in many cases actually worked for the government of Canada. So we brought this video back to members of the Commission to show them the impact that this statement had and how much it actually, how well it articulated what we did. Next slide, please. The interesting thing was that everybody found the presentation very impactful. Everybody understood that we needed to make a change. There was no arguing there. But what was difficult for people was actually implementing a new plain language, and that's because there was really disagreement over what was clear or plain language, and there was a lack of trust in terms of whether or not speaking in clearer terms and more concise terms actually still was able to transmit the information that people needed to get across. So, you know, and this was because people were often way too close to the subject matter, right? So they knew everything there was to know about a subject, and so when they read something that touched very briefly on it, they felt that it didn't say enough or it wasn't precise enough. And so at the time, you know, it was a push back and forth, trying to get across to people that, you know, precision at the expense of clarity is actually self-defeating. You know, adding more detail and adding bigger words does less to help people understand what's actually going on. So as communicators over the next few years, we would consider ourselves as advocates for the audience, right? Because at the end of the day, you know, it's not just about message sent. It's communications as message received. And so that was our responsibility. Since then, we've made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of work to do, and we still have to hammer home this message pretty much every day. And the three reasons that we speak about, and the motivations for people working in the public sector from our perspective, is the three reasons are credibility, inclusion, and accessibility. So I'll start off with credibility. Right now, some people say that we consume the equivalent of about 170 newspapers of information every day. Could be more, could be less, but it's a lot of information. And the way that we've consumed that information has changed. I like to think of my audience now, whenever I'm working on something, I envision my audience as someone standing in front of me at a coffee shop, looking at their phone. And so the reason that's important is because they have so much information in front of them, and we need to cut through that clutter. It has to be clear, because when somebody encounters something that's complex or too difficult to understand, they just move on. So it really means delivering a message in a way that the audience wants, you know, tailoring that message in a way that is accessible and easy for them to understand. Because at the end of the day, clarity, as you can see on my slide, clarity trumps authority. If the authority is too difficult to understand, they'll get their information from somewhere else, and that information may not necessarily be accurate. Next slide, please. So the next slide is in relation to inclusion. Thank you. When I say inclusion, in Canada, we talk a lot about being a diverse country and an inclusive nation, and we speak in terms of our race, our religion, our disability. But it's beyond just that. It's also about how we communicate to one another. Plain language, clear language is about inclusion and accessibility. In Toronto, I've been told that on any given day, there's over 100 languages that are spoken on the streets. And so what that means is that there are a lot of people that are accessing our services that are speaking or that are using their second, third, maybe even fourth language. So it's about making sure that everybody can understand and access the information we're providing. This not only is it about second and third languages, but it's also about literacy. Some suggest that 4 out of 10 Canadian adults don't have the literacy necessary to work in a modern economy. There's stats about how many, I believe it's about half Canadians have trouble reading the instructions on a pill bottle. So when we're communicating these messages, we have to make sure that we're striving for clear and consistent communications, because without it, we're not serving the people that we are mandated to serve, and we're not reaching everybody that we're trying to reach. And the third part, access to justice. As I mentioned, the Canadian Rights Commission is an organization that receives complaints from people when they believe they've been treated unfairly because of because of grounds of discrimination. The idea is that people should be able to use a system that is less complicated, less onerous, and less intimidating than the actual court system. And so what that means is that when people come to our organization, they have to understand how to use the process. And the reality is it is still a legal process, and it is still relatively complicated. So the challenge for us is to be able to explain that in the most straightforward of terms, because if people can't use the process and they can't understand the process, then they do not have access to justice. Next slide, please. So what's changed since the first time we tried to bring this around was that now when we are making efforts to revise our correspondence, revise our explanations, and the letters that we use to work with the complainants and respondents, people who are using our services to resolve disputes and to speak out for their rights. What we've done differently now is we've eliminated the opinion that's involved in plain language by using a process that is quantifiable. As an organization, as a team, whether it's communications and the complaints people, or it's communications and policy development, or the legal team, we can start the process by asking, what's our objective? What's our grade level? What's our readability level that we're aiming for? And so then when we create the text and we're able to run it through an actual process that is a third party, essentially, and that is it's measurable, it has eliminated a great deal of the back and forth and the trust issues that were plaguing us earlier on in this process. Put another way, like, it's not personal, right? And it's not an opinion. So everybody can sit down and look at the numbers together and say, okay, this isn't good enough. We set a target. We haven't yet met it. And so essentially what's happened is it's allowed us, as you can see on the slide, it's given us a great deal more buy-in. It's reduced frustration, improved trust. And it's, as an organization, in doing that, we are seeing increased credibility. More often, we are called by journalists and cited as an authority because what we're presenting to them is easier to understand. And at the same time, both externally and internally, there's a better understanding of what we do. As new people come into the organization, they may not know as much about our mandate, but because the language is clear, they're able to quickly come up to speed on what it is we do and how we're expressing that information. Because at the end of the day, everybody that works for the commission, everybody that works for the organization is a communicator, right? So by improving the language and making it clearer and plainer for everybody, it also increases the number of people who can effectively communicate our messages. And the last piece is when we go back to working with complainants and respondents, by improving the quality of the correspondence and the explanations of how the process works, we spend less time on the phone explaining and re-explaining to people what we were meant to do. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned there, we have made some progress. This is our new mission statement, and just last week, actually, I was at home and I was listening to my 9-year-old son talk to his friend, and they were talking about what their parents did for a living, and I overheard my son saying, his friend said, well, what does your dad do? And he says, oh, he works for the Human Rights Commission. He does a lot of writing, I think. And the guy says, well, what's that? And he says, oh, it's a place where they help everyone be treated fairly. And so, for me, that was a really telling moment, because I must have said this statement to him a few times, and as a 9-year-old, he was able to pick it up and remember it. So, in conclusion, thanks to this clear language initiative that we've been working on for a number of years, more people know about us and about what we do and can explain it, and more people are accessing our services and coming to us when they are in need of help because of discrimination or because of unfair treatment. And as a result of that, we are doing better at promoting equality, promoting inclusion, and helping ensure that everyone is treated fairly, no matter who they are. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Jeff. It's really interesting to hear, especially how it started and how you went from, an incredibly complex mission statement to something that was very, very clear, to from 10 lines to down to 2 in what you're doing. So it's very impressive. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
There's one of the things that you mentioned, which was to be an advocate for the audience, and I'd love to actually ask Kevin on, on the commercial side and working with somebody like Sun Life, how important was that when you were thinking about bringing in a plain language strategy?
It was very much part of our discussions. Jeff, I thought that was a terrific presentation. The role of the writer as understanding particularly our consumer client groups and how difficult a time they have with a lot of the jargon that's typically associated with financial services, marketing, and communications. And so we did our best to empower the writers to do what they could to advocate, but it's a challenge, particularly when a lot of those writers are more junior in the organization than the various subject matter experts and business leaders that they're working with and working for. So just comment about the value of the metrics and the way that they take personal opinion out of the discussion. We found that was a big step forward in empowering the writers.
I can imagine that was probably the same, Manu, for you and for Canada.ca, because, as we were saying, if everyone is a writer, it means everybody gets a voice, but not everybody is necessarily a trained writer. So did you find it helpful as well to be able to have an opportunity to have a non-opinionated tool to help?
Absolutely. We use evidence in basically every decision we make, almost every decision we make, meaning whenever we're presenting anything. So for example, right now, if you go to Canada.ca, just this morning, the website itself, don't go now, you can follow us here, but if you were to go to it, that particular design, the way we sold it, I suppose, to departments was by virtue of the fact that it was tested with over 4,000 people. And the question that came back to me was, oh, you probably tested with public servants. And no, we actually tested with real people. And then we show the data, and basically all the gates would open for us to basically make it go live. So this was done in government terms, record time. And it was really because of the data unlocking all of these gates and blockages that we would normally have had along the way.
Right. And would you agree? I loved one of the sentiments Jeff had about clarity trumps authority. The fact that you can have somebody who may have a huge amount of authority in a field, but simply doesn't have the clarity yet to communicate clearly. Is that something that you would agree with?
Oh, thoroughly. That was one of my favorite slides, by the way, Jeff. I love that, and it's 100% true. Government is the authority on certain things and is not the authority on others. And we find that when we do write things that we're authoritative on, or we have an authority on or responsibility on, it's not written very clearly. And when we do Google these things, or we are using voice assistants to find these things, they're not appearing as the first result. However, when we do apply techniques to reduce the reading level, it has immediate impacts, and the stuff bubbles right up. We've seen it like in reality.
That's fantastic. I'd love to actually hear a little bit more about reality and how we implement or can implement a plain language program. So I think without further ado, I'd love to hand it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Evelyn. We went one step further in the plain language work at Sun Life, and this work is continuing, not just in our Canadian operations, but now in the US and in Asia as well. I had been working in the early stages of implementing plain language across the organization and talking to writers. And what was very clear from pretty much everyone I spoke to was that they understood the value of plain language. They were bought into its best practices and clearly saw why it was important in a financial services organization. But they struggled with a sense of what was the voice that I was asking them to write to. And Evelyn, if you could forward the slide for me. And that makes good sense when you think about your typical brand guideline and the very detailed direction that we give designers. The colors, the background colors, the various ways the logo should be presented, white space around the logo, fonts, and all the rest, page after page after page of direction. And yet when you look at what the writers are given, it's generally very high level. They're given a couple of brand attributes and instructed to align around those attributes as best they can. Go forward for me, please, Evelyn. But here's a great example of what existed in the previous version of the style guide at Sun. You may inject humor into your writing, but only where appropriate. Nobody knew what to do with this. And of course, in a financial services context, humor can actually be quite a dangerous thing to use. If you are being told that your claim has been denied, or you are in the midst of a major life event that is stressful for you, you're not looking for levity from your financial services organization. And so we need to be very, very careful about how we align to a tone of voice inside an insurance company. Go forward, please. There's an emerging understanding of the importance of this. I'm told that globally, about 1 in 10 financial institutions have done the work to develop a detailed brand tone of voice. Certainly Forrester recognizes it. This is from a recent report. Seeing voice as a significant paradigm shift for marketers around the world, and the importance of a voice strategy. If you don't do it now, you risk falling behind. You go forward, Evelyn, there's further recognition, Brand Quarterly, talking about how a brand voice isn't just about external communications, but it is about internal culture. It's about the employee's understanding of what the brand stands for, what the brand represents, and by extension, what is the brand experience that you're attempting to deliver. If you think about the importance of how organizations communicate with their customers in a consumer-empowered environment where expectations are set by the Amazons and the Googles of the world, the Apple, those types of organizations that provide the absolute top shelf customer experiences, they expect that of all of us. And so that's our challenge. And the way that our call center people talk to customers, the way in our B2B environments, our client service people talk to the people at the other end of the phone or in an email, critically important. And you want to manage that as carefully as you can. But of course, there are all kinds of objections to this. Leaders will very often in an organization describe their business as in some way unique, too complex, too technical for a tone of voice that is based on plain language best practices. We're also told that multiple lines of business can be a real issue. This was certainly the case at Sun Life, where 5 different business units just within the Canadian organization drove inconsistency, not just across media, but across the business lines. The existence of both B2B and B2C channels inside an organization, different distribution partners. We at Sun Life would be writing for employers one day, financial advisors another day, and then of course the end consumer still another group to take into consideration. So that kind of complexity and multiple groups, multiple audiences, if you will, how can you possibly come up with a tone of voice that works for all of them? Detailed processes. One of the real fascinating learnings as I started to implement this across the organization was how much writing got done from a process-oriented perspective. The power of the subject matter expert inside an organization really can't be understated. They very often, because they come with the technical knowledge, they very often dominate the discussions when it comes to the writing process. And so you do get a lot of materials that are properly representative of the process, but aren't really written from the consumer or the client's perspective, the audience that you're trying to reach. And of course, the age-old good writers are hard to find. So I've put together a step-by-step process that we followed, and I would recommend to any organization. First is this definition of the brand voice. You want to get that brand positioning down to a few specific words. At Sun Life, we landed on caring, optimistic, and relevant. Now that was really powerful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it resonated in the research that we did with all of our client groups. It positioned Sun Life not as a traditional financial institution, but rather as an organization that genuinely wanted to do right by their people. Caring, not helpful, for example, caring being a more emotional term, wanting to give people a sense that we really did have that sense of caring in all of our work. But you can imagine from a writing perspective, caring, optimistic, and relevant were highly instructive for writers. So if they were writing a piece that denied a claim, for example, or denied coverage, they knew they had to dial up caring really high, and they had to dial up optimistic really high in the form of suggesting alternative products that the customer might consider. The second step that I would encourage you to think about is then build that tone of voice into your brand guidelines and get into as much complexity as you can. It's not going to be as long as the visual representation of the brand, but it certainly needs to be a lot longer than it probably is right now. And take advantage of the fact that if you do have multiple client groups or different distribution partners that you deal with, think about how you're writing for each of those groups. And that's the sort of granular detail that you can put into a brand guideline to help your writers align. A detailed writing guide is next. So this is a companion piece to the brand guidelines. This is an opportunity to re-emphasize the plain language best practices, the use of non-jargon language, obviously, the active versus the passive voice, and all the rest. You want to, what we found, we do a lot of business in different languages. We created ours in English first at Sun Life, and then we went to our partners in Quebec and worked with them on a French language version of the document. That ensured that we got it to an advanced stage that they could then take and not just translate for French-speaking customers, but rather give some thought to how to apply that positioning, that tone of voice, to the unique Quebec marketplace. The fourth step that I would recommend is you need an organizational-wide education plan. Big thing to understand is that virtually everybody in your organization is a writer. And so it's, you know, I would encourage you to think about two levels. You got those who have writing in their job description. Those are your super users. You're going to want to create the right education plan for them. You want to work very closely then with all of those folks who are involved in approval of documents. If you're in a regulated industry, for example, you've probably got legal compliance, and sometimes in financial services, documents require tax review. Those experts need to be in on the discussions, need to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what the outcome ought to look like. And then you want to be thinking about a third tier, which is the employee population at large. I would encourage anyone to look at the various writing analysis products that are out there. Absolutely, wholeheartedly agree with Jeff about the power of the metrics-based discussion. I had a great experience with one of our writers. They had written a very short message that was intended to communicate a change in pricing for compression stockings that diabetes patients use. And the piece of writing read, "The maximum reimbursable amount for compression stockings has changed." And so I encouraged the writer to have another crack at it. I thought that that could be presented in a more plain language way. And I was told a couple things. I was told, number one, Kevin, this has gone through multiple sets of hands. This has been reviewed and reviewed. We really feel that's plain language. And then the second thing I heard was, boy, that sentence exists in a lot of different kinds of documents. So I suggested that the sentence should read, "The amount we cover for compression stockings has changed." I felt that was simpler. Long story short, I ended up on the phone with this person's boss's boss, the vice president of something or other, who was telling me why this couldn't happen. But when I explained to her that what her team had written scored at a 12.8 and what I had written scored at a 7.6, the conversation was over and we got the outcome that we needed. Finally, I would encourage you to think about priority documents and really get the resourcing right. This is critically important. We found that by identifying about 1,000 documents, that this clearly signaled that this was a long-term program, that these rewrites were going to be ongoing. We're talking multiple years of work, but you just keep going. And so encourage leadership to provide you with the kind of resources necessary to get your documents into a state you want them to be in a timely manner. One quick other thing I wanted to share with you. As we were going through this rewrite process, we developed something that was quite radical for our organization and really encouraging. So this is the traditional publications review process. I'm sure you're all familiar with one version or another of this, where the piece starts with the writer up in the top left-hand corner. It then goes for a business input and approval. Legal signs off, compliance signs off, as I say, sometimes tax signs off, the brand people sign off, and then it goes back to the writer. The problem we were having with this process was that it was linear, that legal couldn't approve it until the business approved it, and compliance wouldn't even see it until legal had signed off and sent it along. And that was full of bottlenecks, as you can imagine, particularly with your legal and compliance folks who are often very, very busy. So we created what we called the review panel. And this was often done by conference call. What we did was we brought all of those folks together on the call for a real-time discussion about 2-3 documents at a time. The writer was there, the business representative, whatever subject matter experts we needed were on the call, as were the various other review partners. This was a game changer for us. What this meant was that we were bouncing ideas off of one another about how to get it right. So compliance would ask for a change, but invariably what compliance asked us to do was not in plain language. So as the brand person and brand tone of voice person in particular on the call, I would then take that input from compliance and I would work with the writer on making the change plain language. The thing is, though, we would do it all together while we were on the call. This got us to approval by the end of the call on those documents. The other thing it did, though, was that it taught everybody on the call a little bit more about the other priorities. So legal and compliance, the folks that we were working with on these calls, became some of our best advocates for plain language and our new tone of voice because they understood the perspective that we were working at. By the same token, the business leaders, the subject matter experts who are often making documents more complicated, were starting to hear why that was problematic, and they were being addressed in a respectful way. They were able to raise their concerns without being shot down or feeling like they weren't writers, so their perspective didn't matter. So these calls were, I would say, surprisingly even-keeled. Everyone involved seemed to appreciate them, and there were never any serious conflicts in it. And efficient. We were able to get documents to a much, much better place. It's a difficult thing to do to get this many people onto a call. It's not practical for all of those priority documents that you're going to identify, but it can be a very useful tool, particularly in the early stage of your program, to, as I say, get to consensus around what works for your clients and help with the education process.
That was great, Kevin. Thank you so much. I find it quite interesting to hear, in particular, around, getting so many different people who, are in different parts of the organization, like compliance, all on a call together to discuss this and get everybody on the same page. Jeff, can I ask you, is that something that you would do at the Human Rights Commission as well?
Absolutely. I thought Kevin was right on the mark. Starting with the idea that a content expert often has too much control over the message. And so something that we started to do, a similar process, we're a little smaller, so it's a little bit more informal, but we do as well start to bring people together to determine how the messaging is going to take place and engage the content expert in trying to find a plainer way to say things. And so everybody does learn, sees the benefits of coming to a simpler explanation. And oftentimes, my experience in the last few years has been that oftentimes the content expert is the person who's able to say it in the clearest and plainest way. But like I say, it took some time. Yeah.
I bet. What do you think makes people go from, as you said, you have a subject matter expert who is actually the person who can say it in the plainest way. What do you think is it that then drives people to make something so complex?
I think it has to do with your foundational level of understanding of something, right? So if you are, as a content expert, if you have 1,000 points of knowledge about something, to be speaking about it at a really simple in really simple terms can often feel like you're not touching on enough, and you're not giving enough of that information. The example I often use with people is, if you read, there's certain magazines out there that'll focus on, like, say, Outside Magazine focuses on 25 different sports that you can do. And when you read through them, if you don't do those sports, it's very informative and it's very interesting. But if you hit on one where you're actually into that, you read it and say, well, that doesn't say anything, right? And so it goes back to that, advocating for the audience. It's about making the content expert recognize that if we want to get all of that information to that individual, we have to start at the beginning. We have to start with just a few, basic pieces of information, and then hope that if they want to continue down that path, they can learn more. But we can't give them everything all at once.
I think that is very, very true. I'm very excited now to actually hand over to Manu, because I want to hear about measurement and effectiveness of plain language, which I think hits right into what we were just discussing here. So Manu, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, thanks. I'll open up with the first slide here, which is how we like to open up our presentations here at Treasury Board. And before I go into the presentation, I'll just explain my role or my organization's role in government. So we are a central agency in government. So what we do is basically create policies for departments to follow. And in the past, I think policies have not really existed in this space. And with the recent introduction of a new Minister of Digital here, and a lot of other sort of very good muscle movements in the world of digital, we have been able to sort of put users first. And then we give this guidance to departments, and we learn from specific sort of issues that they're going through, and update our guidance. And our guidance resides in two forms. One is a design specification, and another one, it's good to know we're on the right track, Kevin, is a style guide. It's the Canada.ca style guide. So we use these two tools and constantly improve them. And why do we improve them? Because we want to improve the Government of Canada's digital presence. And fundamentally, we want to improve the tasks that people are coming to our websites to do. And why do we want to do that? And that's where this fact comes in. People have more important things to do than hang out on our websites. And I think in government, I find, and in a lot of other industries as well, there's this preoccupation with wanting to sort of grab people's attention and keep them on our sites for as long as possible. We are going the opposite direction. We want people to come on our sites, get what they need, and then get on with playing with their daughters or running their small businesses and things like that. It's a tough thing to sort of move on, but we are taking these steps very incrementally. And the way we do it, on the next slide, is measure. And I think government, we recognize that we have a problem. But it's kind of like, and the reason why I use a scale here is because we're kind of after Christmas, and some of us may have, put on a little unexpected weight. And the way to lose that weight is to understand, first of all, how much you weigh. And we take that very seriously. So we will find a task, for example, like finding a safety recall or understanding, I want to know if this product is being recalled. And then we measure it. And we measure it usually using moderated testing, and I'll get into those details later. And then it gives people an idea of, okay, we have a benchmark. We have some place to start from. We do the same with reading level. If something is, we find it difficult to read, that's not good enough. You need a number, you need a metric, as we have sort of heard from the previous talks as well here. So we measure because we ultimately want to improve task success, and we measure various sort of areas, and it really gives us numbers to work with, and it gives us evidence, and it gives us the ability to make evidence-based decisions. On the next slide, you'll see really the ways we measure. And this is sort of a subsampling of them, just some cool pictures to show you effectively. But really, the middle one is using heat maps, so or eye tracking, and there, actually this is a heat map, but we do use eye tracking as well, and it gives you an idea of where people are going for certain things, and it gives us layout ideas. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see sort of a moderated usability test where we videotape people using or trying to complete tasks using our content. And then finally on the left-hand side, the first one, the best for last really, there is we use a lot of tree testing. So we try to choose, we try to measure how successful people are in an initial tree test. Then we use that to adjust labels and actual words. And then we retest again to see if that improves. All of this really put together gives us evidence. And again, like the videos on the right-hand side that you'll see, you won't see the video, but we create videos. We take them and we show people struggling to read and understand the content. And part of government's issue is, and in a lot of organizations as well, is we're in our glass walls here, and we aren't connected with the consumers of the content that we're writing. And we use testing to actually create that empathy and bring the user into the boardrooms so that senior executives see people struggling with something and then they're compelled to fix it. We had a session once with a top task expert, Jerry McGovern, where he once brought up a visa requirement page for a Government of Canada program. And the team that saw it, and they saw users struggling with it, and they saw him talk about it, went back, and based upon that, they that evidence that they saw with their own eyes, they were compelled to want to improve it. So measurement for us serves multiple purposes, but at Treasury Board, we're trying to move a very large enterprise, which is the Government of Canada, towards caring more about users fundamentally. And on the next slide, reading levels are critical to this. A lot of people talk about systems and technical and technology things. For example, voice assistants and whatnot. All of this is driven by content. The words matter. And what we're finding is on the left-hand side, you'll see a particular task, someone trying to find out about road traffic and air pollution. And the readability on it is 14.3. Our targets are usually between grade 6 to 8 reading levels because that reflects the North American population, who are the primary consumers of our content. And what we do is we have a team that goes in and works to sort of redesign this content using something called content design, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then through content design, applying plain language techniques and using what we've seen in the videos, we adjust the content. And it gives us a better grade level, as you can see, grade 7.3. Now, the grade level is part of it, but ultimately it's feeding into something called task success. On the left-hand side, most of our content is showing about a 50% completion rate, which is quite terrible, if you think about it. But after we go through and do some cycles of improvement, we're seeing big jumps of 20%, sometimes 35%. On average, we're ranging between 20 and 35% improvement just by adjusting the words on the page. And going back to something that Kevin was speaking to, having the lawyers, having the policy folks in the room help these changes go through much quicker. We don't have anything as systematic, I think, as Kevin was describing, but when we do these task improvement projects, we do our best to ensure that, well, we require program level participation so that they learn, they see the impacts of this, so that the next time someone comes around to wanting to improve something, they don't encounter resistance. On the next slide, you'll see another example here of applied content design. So really here in this particular example, the page was getting quite a high volume page around asbestos, getting over 13,000 views a month. It was quite popular. But the time people were spending on this page was just astonishing. I mean, 5 minutes to try to figure out how to do something here was quite challenging. We measured the readability at grade 13, and there's quite a few words. We use some design techniques that we have documented in the Canada.ca style guide to improve how this page is laid out. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see how that looks. So we applied a template, we chunked the content, and we used techniques to basically drive down the readability level. So you see it went from 13.3 to 7.8, which hits most Canadians now. Jumping back to the top, the actual visits to this page increase. So going back to what Jeff was speaking to, when you write clearly, your content is more attractive to search, and people can access it. And you can see that in the leap in access or reads that it was getting. And finally, and this is the last point at the bottom right, is we're accomplishing much more with less. And that is so big. I mean, people are constantly trying to write more and explain more and create backgrounders and FAQs and quite a bit more content. What we're finding, and which is huge importance, is the less we write, the more successful people are in completing tasks with our content. Moreover, the less content there is on a particular topic, the more successful people are in finding it. And it confuses search engines when you have 3 pages named health risk to asbestos backgrounder, health risk to asbestos FAQ. It doesn't give the engine basically a vector to follow on providing that information up front. And by decreasing the amount of content by reducing redundant, obsolete, trivial content, we've also noticed a big improvement in task success. So that's all I have to say really around the measurement piece and how successfully we apply it. And yeah, I look forward to questions on this.
Very much appreciate that. Thanks, Manu. I would love to. One of the things we were talking about, sitting in a glass wall. I think every business can relate to that, because we do sometimes get very much stuck in the weeds and stuck in our own organizational language. I'm wondering, Kevin or Jeff, do you have any tips of what you might do? Maybe starting with you, Kevin, of how you come out of that, that glass house. How do you break down those walls to speak a more common language?
2 things. One, strategically, you do very much need senior executive buy-in on the program. You need a very carefully designed internal communication strategy around that, because you've got to signal to people that the way they've communicated in the past, at least so far as client-facing materials goes, isn't going to cut it. Second thing I'd say is one of the things that I really enjoyed in the VisibleThread program tools was the ability to customize it to our tone of voice. So certain terms are required. You have to use them. So for example, when we were writing for financial advisors, if we didn't use certain industry standard terms, it would be confusing to them. It would actually be less clear. And so the ability to customize our writing and the way that the software analyzed our writing, customize that to our tone of voice and our guidelines for each client group, was hugely valuable.
I can imagine that buy-in is incredibly important. How about you, for you, Jeff?
I would agree. I mean, I think it's a major challenge to get across to people inside those glass walls that our perspective is very different from those seeing it from the outside, and it's something that I feel that it's something that we have to raise almost with every project, because the way we talk about things, even just internally, are it inadvertently shows how much we are self-centered in the way we describe things. I'll give you an example. If you are someone who files a complaint with the Human Rights Commission, then you would say to somebody, "I submitted my complaint." We refer to those as complaints received. Right. So even in the way that we describe something simple like that, it took us a long time to recognize that when we're talking to an external audience, we're speaking to them from the perspective that they don't have, which is the expression we use is we're describing it from inside the car, right? And so nobody else can really understand when we're talking like that. No one can understand what we mean, because they're not experiencing it from the same perspective. And I see it as an ongoing challenge.
Absolutely. I want to thank all 3 of you, and just mention before we get to the questions to everyone listening, if you do want to dip your toe into using some technology to support you in your plain language strategy, head over to VT Readability in our product section. It's a free tool, and you can upload some of your own copy and test how clearly you're communicating with your audience. So I'm going to have a look at some of the questions here. So Nicole was asking, where do these levels come from for the measurements mentioned? For example, readability number, how is that deciphered? So part of that, if perhaps, Manu, do you want to take that one?
Well, I mean, from our perspective, we're using tools like VisibleThread to do sort of the mass measurement and give us back sort of those hints on how to improve it. And we also use Microsoft Word, has its own Flesch Kincaid measure, but it's a little trickier to use for web content because you have to copy paste it in. The actual algorithms, I'll let you speak to that.
Yes, so the behind what I think what is very powerful, and I think all three of you have mentioned it, is grade level, and that is one of the things that VisibleThread does measure, and it is very, very simply saying what grade level do you need to be to understand this content, this content. And generally what you should be aiming for is a level 6 to 8. And it has nothing to do with, potentially dumbing down language. It has simply to do with the fact that you want to get your point across in the best possible way. So we use grade level to describe how hard it is to understand something. And I think that actually answers your second question as well, Nicole, in terms of where do those numbers come from? They come from outside the VisibleThread tool. And if you do go into VT Readability, check it out. I think you're going to find it quite interesting to see how the readability is measured and how in particular grade level is measured. We have a question here from Jeff, again for Manu. Is using questions and headings a good strategy to optimize for voice search?
From the research that we've seen, in most situations, no. However, in some situations, it does work. What we're finding is, and my team would be the experts to speak on this more than I, to be quite frank, they've found that they've used Google Dialogflow to design the actual interactions in the wizards, and in doing so, they've stayed away from the questions so much because it's not, the question itself is not recognized very well. When you make a statement, it's far more impactful. So we generally in our project stay away from questions unless through testing we discover that it actually does have a positive impact. But our general rule is staying away from using questions as headers.
Yes. And then we have one here from Jessica, how to sell leadership on importance of measurement, investing in measurement ideas. Maybe Jeff, do you want to speak to that? Because I think you had a very good story at the beginning about the video on the mission statement. Was that a great tool to show leadership that there needed to be a change?
Yeah, I think it was a very powerful way to demonstrate, to go back to that idea of being outside of the glass walls. It was similar to watching a video of people navigating through a website, because it wasn't just what people were saying when they finished reading the text, it was also their facial expression that gave away just how difficult it was for them to understand what they were reading. So like I said, it was there was an immediate buy-in in terms of the need to change it, but what was more difficult was, what does that look like and how do we go about doing that? And that's what took longer time.
Mm. And then into measurement itself, was it something difficult to explain to leadership, hey, this is something that we can actually measure?
No, once we were able to demonstrate that it was measurable, that actually, I think, brought people around even more and made them trust in what we were doing. Like I was saying earlier, the measurement part for us was we were able to set a goal and then show whether or not we'd reach that goal. Up until before we were using measurement techniques, what was happening was it came across as a matter of opinion, and people would often feel that their writing was being criticized or attacked by somebody else. And so there was often a lot of tension between not just tension about saying, oh well, you're really altering the meaning of my text, but also just they took it personally as an affront to their ability to write in general. Mm-hmm. So the measurement really changed the conversation.
There are different types of measurement too, right? I think one of the things you'll find is if you simply talk to leadership about the measurability of improvements, just in terms of understandability of the writing, that's really not going to resonate that much with them. But if you can show them that the call to action is more effectively taken up as a result of these changes, if it's going to produce more leads, more sales, etc., that's really going to lock it in for you.
Agreed. Quantifying it has such an impact. In government, it's on call centers. It's one of the most expensive channels for us. And if we can help people complete tasks using better language on our websites, it translates to better savings for the taxpayer.
Yeah, reduced calls, right? That's a big metric.
Absolutely. We had a similar experience where when we revamped our website, a previous generation of our website, we were able to see the impact almost immediately, because the number of calls that we received dropped dramatically.
I do think that has a big impact, and I think at the end of the day, you know, when you're trying to convince leaders, it's often about the bottom line. And I think we've had some fantastic examples from all three panelists today about how plain language actually influences how you communicate with your audience, and therefore you have better communications. And I think whether you're in working in human rights, or in financial, or for the government, that is, it's a bottom line that you can influence. We've come to the top of the hour. I know there are a couple of questions left, and I will aim to get back to those questions and those people asking directly. So I do want to say thank you so much to Jeff, Kevin, and Manu for joining us today, and everybody listening. I hope you found it all useful. I'd be grateful if you find a couple of minutes to answer our survey at the end. But for now, I wish you all a pleasant remaining Thursday, and thank you for joining.
Thanks. Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.